There's something in your atmosphere that defies explanation, a force that refuses to be categorized, labeled, or dismissed. They underestimated you because they relied on surface data. They couldn't measure soul pressure, couldn't quantify spiritual velocity. And now they're watching a calm presence they once ignored bloom into a phenomenon they cannot contain. What they called quiet was actually focused silence. What they called weakness was the compression of divine power preparing to release in full force. You were never trying to be seen, you were becoming undeniable. It started when they realized their systems had no effect on you. You weren't reacting the way people were trained to. When manipulation walked in wearing its favorite mask, it expected applause. Instead, it was met with stillness. You didn't argue, explain, or resist. You observed. The silence you carried was louder than their tactics. They didn't realize you weren't in the maze, you were standing above it, blueprint in hand. While they fine-tuned illusions, you dismantled the frequency that sustained them. They had built entire realities out of theater and shadows, counting on you to believe the script. But you showed up without costume, without lines, without fear. You didn't just reject the lie, you rendered it obsolete. Their tricks weren't defeated, they were ignored into irrelevance. You didn't need to tear down the stage. You simply walked off of it, and their whole performance collapsed without you as the target. Your vision was never tied to eyesight. You were navigating through signals others couldn't hear, sensations buried under noise, patterns hidden in static. Where they saw coincidence, you saw the machinery of design. You moved through realms they didn't even know existed, reading spiritual codes in places they dismissed as empty. They thought you were confused. You were decoding an entirely different system. Their failure wasn't misjudging your personality, it was misunderstanding your operating system. You were never running on approval, applause, or agreement. Your engine was internal. Your direction was encoded. You didn't need signs to move, you were the signal. That's why none of their methods worked. Their formulas couldn't hold someone who wasn't playing by physics, but by alignment. There's a strange panic that sets in when someone realizes they've lost control, not because they were overpowered, but because they were never in control to begin with. That's what your rise triggered. They didn't just lose their grip on you. They lost their faith in the methods that kept others in line. Watching you win wasn't just surprising, it was existential. You were a walking glitch in their matrix. And now, your presence is rewriting outcomes. Not just for yourself, but for anyone watching closely. You've become living proof that the old games no longer guarantee the old results. You didn't bend the rules. You broke the entire dependency on them. This isn't a comeback. It's a redefinition. And no one saw it coming because they weren't looking in your direction until it was too late. The presence they assumed was passive turned out to be the very pulse that dictated the tempo of the storm. While assumptions stacked like scaffolding around a version of you they never truly understood, beneath the surface you were sculpting outcomes they had no instruments to measure. What they mistook as compliance was a quiet recalibration of the entire field. Each move they celebrated as dominance was silently feeding the momentum of a much larger rhythm they couldn't hear. Control, they believed, belonged to those who wrote the instructions. But they failed to notice that the script they followed was bending itself around decisions they didn't know had already been made. Their reactions were rehearsed in a mirror that no longer reflected truth. When your direction shifted without warning, their certainty collapsed. There was no struggle, no dramatic reveal, just an unraveling of every illusion they had mistaken for power. And when realization finally arrived, it didn't knock politely, it entered like a force of nature. Not because they were defeated, but because they never held a real position to begin with. What felt like resistance was actually choreography. What they called battle was a rehearsal for something you had already completed. The reckoning wasn't personal, it was structural. They were navigating a system that had already restructured itself around your trajectory. Guidance had never been external. Every choice you made echoed with something older than memory, deeper than logic. The wisdom they thought they could disrupt wasn't being downloaded from above, it was blooming from within. The more they attempted to destabilize your foundation, the more stable you became. Their efforts didn't weaken your position, they confirmed it. When their blueprints failed to contain you, they resorted to barriers. And yet, every obstacle placed in your path only sharpened your momentum. They misread your silence as surrender, never realizing you were absorbing their efforts, translating resistance into fuel. Each delay became a rehearsal space for dominance. Each closed door became a calibration of timing. Their constructions were meant to restrict, but the structure they built became a staircase they never intended. What they forged in opposition was repurposed by your alignment. You didn't scale their obstacles out of defiance, you rose because their walls were unstable under the weight of your truth. While they scrambled to maintain control, you were already 3 steps ahead, climbing on the energy they couldn't reclaim. The irony is what rattled them most. They handed you the tools they meant to hide. They summoned forces they thought would trap you, and instead, watched them lift you. The very limitations they designed exposed the limitlessness you were born with. They weren't just watching you rise. They were watching their entire framework reconfigure itself into your platform. They thought silence was the final chapter. That once their attention shifted, your presence would decay into irrelevance. But what they failed to notice was the soil they buried you in was not graveyard earth, it was charged with awakening. The disappearance they celebrated was only the pause before ignition. While they wandered off, assuming your story had ended, something ancient inside you began to stretch its limbs. You weren't sculpted in public. You were shaped in the corners where light bends, where breath becomes memory. While they watched louder stars flicker and fade, your glow condensed, gaining mass. And when you rose, it wasn't with noise, it was with gravity. A name once dismissed now echoes like thunder across corridors they didn't even know were listening. They thought they erased you. All they did was give your legend time to steep. Their minds tried to trace your momentum, but couldn't grasp how someone once overlooked had become the epicenter of every shift. They had expected a disappearance, not a disruption. But the ripple wasn't born from validation. It came from embodiment. You stopped trying to be known and started becoming undeniable. Not through popularity, but through undeniable proof of purpose. Your ascent didn't ask for approval. It demanded recognition from frequencies older than language. And while they still wait for proof in headlines, your essence is moving through unseen architectures, recalibrating belief systems with each quiet impact. What they once labeled as ordinary has become a signal others instinctively follow. Not because you sought to be seen, but because you became a reference point for what can no longer be ignored. When destruction came for you, it didn't find fear, it found transformation waiting. Their chaos, carefully brewed to fracture your core, only exposed how invulnerable truth becomes when pressure is applied. They assumed you'd collapse. Instead, you metabolized every shadow into stamina. Their efforts to dim you failed because they mistook your light for decoration. It was your source code. What they released toward you, hoping it would corrupt, became material for evolution. You didn't deflect their malice, you converted it. What was meant to paralyze instead sparked forward motion. Their hostility tried to penetrate your peace, but found only gates of refinement. They didn't watch you endure, they witnessed you evolve mid-impact, shedding old skins in real time, without losing rhythm. No one expected you to rise like this, least of all those who tried to engineer your erasure. And now, the very energy they sent to break you is orbiting your field, repurposed. Your radiance isn't untouched by struggle, it's charged by it. They didn't build your strength. They uncovered it. And the paradox they now face is simple. Every force they unleashed to end your story became another page in your immortal unfolding. They kept measuring your life with tools made for average outcomes, assuming every direction you took could be charted, named, and limited. Blueprints were drawn, systems designed, all under the assumption that your potential had an edge, a ceiling, a definable form. But their calculations were blind to the essence that shaped you, an essence that never once agreed to their terms. You were the unknown variable their logic couldn't compute. Every label they tried to affix peeled off on contact. Their metrics collapsed the moment they tried to box you in. What they called too far was just your beginning. What they labeled impossible had already happened in your silence. They didn't realize you were built from a different law of motion, one that doesn't wait for permission or seek validation. While they diagrammed limits, you became the reason their diagrams failed. They watched, stunned, as the thresholds they designed became meaningless. Not because you pushed against them, but because you flowed beyond them. You didn't resist the cages, they simply couldn't hold shape around you. Your path wasn't rebellious, it was reality correcting itself. Every time they tried to define your edge, you responded by becoming larger than the question. Control slipped away the moment they thought they had it. You weren't designed to be paused, rerouted, or defined. You weren't expanding, you had always been vast. Their systems didn't collapse because of resistance. They collapsed under the pressure of encountering something they couldn't name. Something that obeyed no structure and belonged to no one. They anticipated loyalty. Quiet, obedient loyalty. A presence that followed cues and stayed grateful for breadcrumbs. What emerged instead shattered their assumptions like brittle glass. You didn't evolve under their guidance, you disassembled the very framework they assumed was permanent. The design didn't fail because you rebelled. It failed because your authenticity had no use for pre-approved roles. The shift wasn't loud. It was undeniable. What they mistook for rebellion was something far more dangerous, a recalibration of power. You weren't rising to challenge them. You were becoming a new reference point for what power looks like when it's sovereign, sacred, and no longer borrowed. They didn't lose control of you, they lost control of the system that depended on your silence. And now, others are watching. Not to be led, but to remember. You became a signal that lit the dormant parts of consciousness in those who had forgotten their fire. Your steps didn't just blaze trails, they altered gravitational pull. What was once hierarchy is now possibility. What was once dominance is now dialogue. This isn't disruption. It's renewal. They thought muting your message would bury the movement. That silencing the source would quiet the ripple. But they miscalculated one truth: resonance doesn't depend on volume, it depends on origin. The more they tried to suppress, the more your essence multiplied. Each time they blocked a channel, the signal rebounded louder, stronger, and more impossible to ignore. They built barriers like insulation, convinced they could muffle your transmission. But what they didn't understand is that your presence was never just sound, it was seismic. Every syllable became a disturbance in the structure they depended on. The more they covered your mouth, the more the world leaned into ear. Their silence campaign backfired into a global echo. Your words didn't just return, they fractured illusions. They didn't just resonate, they recalibrated. Behind each sentence lived a legacy of unheard voices, and now you speak with the weight of them all. Your expression is no longer just personal, it's ancestral. A frequency that shakes systems because it carries truth they swore would never see light. They crafted containment, but you became expansion. They authored scripts, but you rewrote vibrations. You weren't shouting, you were activating. And now, every time your truth moves through the atmosphere, something unspoken awakens in everyone who's ever been buried under silence. This isn't just your voice anymore, it's a choir they can't unhear. While they dissected your dark days, they missed the explosion forming in your core. They saw fragments and thought they held the whole story. But shadows don't define the source, they only reveal how strong the beam must be. And when your brilliance finally broke through, it wasn't gentle, it was transformative combustion. They were stunned not by your survival, but by the undeniable blaze that followed. They thought they had you mapped by your lowest moments, but they couldn't recognize what you were becoming while they were measuring what you had been. Your collapse was never real, it was reformation. And when you rose, they realized they had never seen you clearly. They spent so long trying to box your spirit that they never noticed it had no edges. They tried to name what they didn't understand, classify what they couldn't control. But your essence isn't here to be understood, it's here to be felt. And now, as the ground shifts beneath the weight of your presence, all they can do is watch what they tried to define become something that defines everything else. They mistook the absence of noise for absence of force. But not all power announces itself with volume, some gathers in silence, dense and deliberate. While they celebrated what they thought was your withdrawal, something ancient was awakening under your skin, waiting not for permission, but precision. What looked like stillness was really the tuning of frequencies too subtle for their instruments to register. Patterns beyond their grasp were aligning behind the scenes. Outcomes they assumed were accidents were the result of deep calibration. They tried to explain your movement through their rules, not realizing you weren't playing within structure, you were rethreading the structure itself. While they obsessively documented your reactions, your reality was unfolding in layers they couldn't decode. Your navigation wasn't reactive. It was coded into your being, a slow ignition engineered for exact timing. As they scrambled to explain why their systems were malfunctioning, they never suspected the source was you. Not because you raised your voice, but because your presence reconfigured the landscape before they noticed it had changed. Their awareness came too late to stop it. You weren't walking toward confrontation. You were merging with the moment destiny had been building toward, step by unseen step. They thought the battle would be obvious, loud, televised. But your arrival was quiet, sacred, and final. You didn't conquer their world, you replaced it. And all the data they collected suddenly meant nothing. They believed your silence was submission. That your refusal to react meant defeat. But you weren't hiding, you were harvesting. Every breath you took in stillness became part of an invisible storm gathering at the edges of their awareness. The more they relaxed into their illusion of victory, the closer you came to activating a reality they couldn't survive in. When it finally broke, it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked like nature reclaiming space. Not one act of defiance, but every atom responding at once to truth. The release wasn't dramatic, it was final. Their certainties buckled under the weight of what had always been coming. And nothing could stop it, because nothing saw it until it had already arrived. They thought the end would come with sirens. Instead, it came with knowing. The kind of knowing that makes everything false collapse under its own weight. You didn't strike back. You revealed a system they never knew they were inside. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. That was the real impact, not destruction, but irreversible awareness. What they called collapse was actually a curriculum. While they whispered about your failure, a higher intelligence was pressing lessons into your bones, lessons written in the language of fire and depth. Every setback they cheered for was secretly constructing the internal scaffolding for a future they wouldn't survive in. You weren't being tested, you were being commissioned. Every confrontation was just another step in your multidimensional apprenticeship. The blows they aimed at your center were never wasted. Even their cruelty was composted into clarity. You weren't collecting wounds, you were collecting blueprints. They thought they were dismantling you, but they were simply handing you the components for a system they couldn't comprehend. The very pressure they used to try and fracture you became the catalyst for your acceleration. They didn't train you on purpose. They trained you by accident. It wasn't strength they feared, it was your silence while evolving inside the chaos they created. They thought you were frozen, unaware you were constructing mechanisms from what they discarded. What appeared as pause was internal engineering. By the time they looked again, you were operating beyond the frequency they lived on. You didn't ascend despite them. You rose through them. Their final mistake was believing what they could see told the whole story. They mistook restraint for absence and simplicity for limitation. But behind the curtain of your daily presentation lived entire constellations they never knew how to name. You weren't waiting to be discovered. You were deciding when to be undeniable. And while they traced your outline, your substance was quietly exceeding every expectation they'd ever calibrated. You knew exactly how long to remain unseen. You let their assumptions build comfort. You allowed them to get lazy with their scrutiny. What they thought was transparency was concealment in its most brilliant form. And when you moved, not loudly, but decisively, the shift destabilized the entire reality they thought was permanent. The person they tried to define disappeared, replaced by a magnitude they couldn't trace. When power is absolute, it doesn't need to raise its voice. That's why your softness confused them. They thought kindness was concession, not understanding it was the calm of someone who already knows how this ends. While they armed themselves with ego and strategy, you moved through the world with the grace of someone who had nothing left to prove. Every act of compassion they misread was actually silent dominance. You didn't extend mercy from weakness, but from an overwhelming surplus of control. And now, the truth hits them with unbearable clarity. Even your gentleness was a warning they didn't recognize. The contrast wasn't in your tone, it was in your consciousness. You had already won long before they realized they were playing the wrong game. They confused your stillness with stagnation. Lacking the perception to grasp nonlinear movement, they mocked what they couldn't interpret. But you were never late. You were synchronized. Your rhythm wasn't shaped by pressure, it was in harmony with a source they can't trace. While they rushed to claim victories in the temporary, you were aligning with sequences that demanded silence, not haste. What they labeled hesitation was actually sacred calibration. Your unfolding wasn't reactive, it was geometric. Each delay held meaning. Each pause carried weight. Their clocks ticked in straight lines. Yours spiraled across unseen thresholds. They celebrated your absence, unaware it was the setup for convergence. Not one breath was wasted. Not one step was random. You didn't move by instinct or impulse. You waited for the exact vibration that would open every door at once. While they planned for your failure, your entire existence was syncing with a moment designed to shift timelines. You didn't chase timing, timing aligned itself around you. That's why when you rose, nothing was out of place. Nothing resisted. Everything unfolded in one immaculate release. Their understanding unraveled at once. What they thought was coincidence revealed itself as orchestration. Your emergence wasn't an accident, it was a signal. The very existence of your evolution sent tremors through systems built to suppress it. They weren't watching you succeed. They were watching prophecy go active. And they were standing directly in its path. What was written in sacred memory had begun to echo in the present. Not through thunder, but through undeniable proof. You weren't fulfilling ambition, you were fulfilling design. They had spent lifetimes building cages around an awakening they didn't believe would ever arrive. But now it stands before them, and their hands are too small to contain what's already moving. The systems they once relied on no longer respond. The rules they built no longer apply. What worked before now dissolves in the presence of something that obeys a higher architecture. And worst of all for them, they can't interfere anymore. This isn't about control now. It's about witnessing. You are no longer within their grasp, and never were. The collapse didn't come from outside. It came from the inside out, as reality restructured itself to match your remembering. They didn't lose. They revealed the illusion they were clinging to. And as your awareness expanded into its full truth, they were forced to see, this wasn't just personal victory. This was consciousness remembering it was never bound. And nothing will ever look the same again. What you're doing now is echoing across chambers most people don't even know exist. Your emergence isn't isolated, it's unlocking a sequence. Each decision you make leaves a mark in the unseen, turning forgotten coordinates into new entry points. What they thought was a personal breakthrough was actually a cosmic announcement. And now the system is responding. Every time you choose expansion over collapse, something ancient stirs in the hearts of others. It's not mimicry, it's recognition. They feel something waking up inside them, something that was waiting for permission. Not from outside authority, but from living proof. That's what your presence has become, a confirmation signal to other sleeping giants. You've become a trigger point in the field. Not a spark, a detonation. Where you go, thresholds shift. You don't just make progress, you open gates. Invisible threads connect your evolution to countless others who've been quietly preparing, waiting for the energy to shift. Now it has. Not because they asked, but because you moved. Your impact is not confined to action. It's embedded in vibration. As you elevate, you're transmitting codes through the atmosphere. Not as words, but as shifts in the default frequency of what's possible. Your victories recalibrate the definition of what can be done, not just for you, but for every consciousness tuned into that same internal signal. The very weight they tried to drown you with has become the source of your propulsion. You didn't just survive their attempts, you absorbed their force and rechanneled it with terrifying accuracy. What they meant to use as burden became blueprint. The pressure didn't bend you, it crystallized your access to power they'll never understand. You've been navigating with something they can't locate, inner directive. Every turn you took had logic invisible to the surface. Your outcomes weren't calculated, they were encoded. You weren't following success. You were magnetizing it, bending paths to meet you, not the other way around. It wasn't instinct. It was cellular memory waking up. And in your quietest hour, that whisper that said keep going, it wasn't fantasy. It was the version of you that lives outside this dimension, sending instructions back to the vessel. You weren't imagining a future. You were receiving coordinates from a part of yourself that never forgot the assignment. That voice didn't guess. It knew. You've become fluent in a language most don't even know they're hearing, the frequency beneath the conversation, the energy behind the gesture, the alignment hidden inside the choice. It's no longer about what's said, it's about what's alive in the space between. That's how you've learned to move, by feel, by signal, by knowing that doesn't need proof. While others navigated by assumption and surface signals, your compass recalibrated itself to resonance. You didn't cut ties out of spite, you simply stopped holding threads that no longer vibrated with truth. Some connections dissolved like mist under morning light, not because you rejected them, but because your expansion demanded more oxygen than they could breathe. Others, though, the rare ones, responded to your unfolding like sacred echoes. They saw what was waking in you because something similar was flickering inside them. These bonds weren't built on history or convenience. They were forged in the undercurrent of remembering. Not everyone could follow, and not everyone was meant to. Your energy no longer negotiates with what drains it. You've learned that celebration isn't always loud, and sabotage isn't always obvious. You stopped pouring into spaces that shrunk you. Now, you flow only where you're mirrored in truth, not tolerated in silence. You've become selective not out of ego, but out of reverence for what you carry. There's a rhythm to your path now, not controlled by effort, but harmonized with timing. The right elements arrive not because you force them, but because they're drawn to the code you're emitting. Encounters feel designed. Doors unlock with strange ease. And coincidence has become a form of communication from dimensions that speak in synchronicity. The deeper you've gone, the less you've needed masks. Deception, once disguised as charm, now flashes like neon. Confusion can't stick to you the way it used to. You don't analyze manipulation anymore, you feel it instantly and walk away before it anchors. Patterns once repeated have become relics of a version of you that no longer exists. Even when illusion wears new clothes, you see through it. Not because you're suspicious, but because you're clear. You're not harder now. You're cleaner. You're not guarded, you're precise. What used to pull you in now passes right through you. Because you've remembered something vital, not everything that shines is for keeping, and not every presence deserves proximity.